I am Harper Collins, 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed my sister Rachel would always stand beside me. I built a business from scratch, gave her more than anyone ever knew, and when she got engaged, I even opened the doors of my own estate for her wedding at a fraction of its cost. I thought it was an act of love, a way of showing her that no matter what our parents had done, I was still her family. But then the phone rang. It was her wedding planner saying my invitation had been canceled while the $65,000 deposit I had given them would not be returned. Imagine hearing that from your own sister's wedding. Imagine realizing the people you trusted most had decided you no longer belonged. What happened next would not only test every bond I thought was unbreakable, but expose secrets none of us were ready to face. And by the end, my family learned a lesson they never expected. Before I take you back to where it all began, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back when family tried to push you aside. I grew up in a modest 2-story house on the edge of Denver, Colorado, where the winters came in sharp and the summers seemed endless. My sister Rachel was 2 years older than me, and in the eyes of our parents, she could do no wrong. Dad always said she was the responsible one. Mom always bragged about her grades while I was told I was strong enough to figure things out on my own. Being the younger sister should have meant I was the one looked after, but somehow it worked in reverse. I became the one packing my own lunch, finding my own rides, and teaching myself how to navigate the world. Even soy adored Rachel. I shadowed her everywhere from the soccer field where she played forward to the library where she liked to sit in the corner with a stack of novels. When she got nervous before tests, I would slip a granola bar into her backpack with a note that said, "You got this." She would grin, roll her eyes, and eat it anyway. She was my sister, my anchor, even when the scales of attention in our family tipped heavily toward her side. Our parents worked long hours. Dad was a construction foreman, gone before sunrise, and home after dark, his hands cracked and calloused. Mom was a nurse pulling double shifts at the hospital. With them absent so much, it was often just Rachel and me rattling around the house. Dinner was cereal or microwave pasta, chores were split but usually fell to me. Rachel had a way of stepping back and letting me take on more, yet she also had moments when she leaned on me like no one else could. I remember one afternoon when we were kids, maybe I was 10 and she was 12. We walked home from school together, and a group of older boys followed us down the block. They started mocking Rachel for the braces on her teeth, calling her tin grin, laughing as she kept her head down. I felt anger burning in my chest. Without thinking, I stepped in front of her and told them to knock it off. My voice shook, but I held my ground. They eventually lost interest and wandered away, leaving Rachel red-faced and silent. That night, she slipped into my room and sat cross-legged at the foot of my bed. She whispered that she had never had anyone stand up for her like that before. She reached for my hand and promised me clear as day that no matter what life threw at us, she would always be on my side. I can still remember the weight of that promise, the way her eyes shone in the dim light. For a long time, I believed it with all my heart. As we grew older, the favoritism at home became more obvious. Rachel was praised for every little accomplishment while my successes were brushed aside. When she made varsity soccer, Dad took her out for ice cream. When I won a statewide essay contest, Mom smiled distractedly and said dinner was in the fridge. It stung, but I learned to find validation outside our house. I worked harder, joined debate club, got part-time jobs, and built resilience. Rachel, though, knew how to play the role of the golden child. She never fought the praise, never redirected it toward me, but in private, she sometimes leaned against me, confiding that the attention was suffocating. She would sigh that she wished Mom and Dad saw her for who she really was, not just the perfect daughter. I listened, comforted her, and reminded her that at least she had someone to talk to. There were good times too, moments that made me forget the imbalance. On summer nights, we would sit on the roof of the garage, feet dangling, watching fireflies. We talked about dreams, mine of building something of my own one day, hers of marrying someone kind and having a house full of books. We shared secrets about crushes and fears, laughed until our sides hurt. Those nights convinced me that blood truly was thicker than water, that no matter what happened with our parents, Rachel and I had each other. One winter, we built a fort in the backyard, piling up snow walls taller than we were. Inside, shivering under blankets, we declared it our secret hideout, a place no one else could enter. Rachel carved our initials with a stick into the wall, and I remember the pride in her voice when she said, "This is ours forever." Even when the sun came out and the fort melted away, I carried that memory like proof that she valued me as much as I valued her. But shadows always lingered at the edges. I could not ignore how teachers, relatives, even neighbors compared us, always favoring Rachel. I was the one who stood up for her, carried the groceries, fixed the broken faucet, yet she was the one applauded at family gatherings. Sometimes I wanted to scream at the unfairness, but instead I bottled it up and smiled. She was my sister. She had promised to stand by me. That promise mattered more than any praise from others. The years slipped by. I went off to college in Boulder, working nights to cover tuition while Rachel stayed closer to home. Our paths began to diverge, but the bond we built in childhood remained in my mind like steel. Every time I stumbled, I thought of her promise. Every time I achieved something, I wished she would be there clapping the loudest. I carried those memories into adulthood like a shield. They reminded me that even if the world tilted against me, Rachel and I were unbreakable. At least that is what I believed back then, before time and choices began to test us in ways I could never have imagined. When I graduated college in 2011, I did not have much more than a used laptop, a secondhand couch, and a dream that refused to leave me alone. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment just outside downtown Denver, the kind of place where the paint peeled from the ceiling and the heating rattled in the winter. From that cramped space, I started Summit Venues, my first attempt at building a business in event planning. I spent nights drafting proposals at the kitchen table and mornings cold calling strangers who rarely picked up. At first, the only clients I could land were birthday parties in basements and community banquets where I was paid in checks that barely cleared. I stretched every dollar, skipping dinners out, mending the same blazer to look professional at meetings. I remember walking into networking events with my heart pounding, clutching business cards I had printed on discount paper, trying to convince anyone who would listen that I could make their celebrations unforgettable. Most brushed me off, but a handful gave me a chance, and slowly I built a reputation. By 2014, I had scraped together enough savings to open Harper's Catering. The idea came after too many clients complained about unreliable food services. I thought if I could control the meals as well as the venue, I could offer something seamless. I hired 2 young chefs from a culinary school and leased a tiny commercial kitchen near Union Station. The first 6 months were brutal. I carried trays myself, washed dishes until my hands cracked, and drove delivery vans through snowstorms. There were nights I fell asleep in the kitchen with the smell of roasted garlic in my hair. But the gamble worked. People noticed the care we put in, and word spread. 3 years later, in 2017, I signed papers for my first boutique hotel in Aspen. It was the biggest risk I had ever taken, a renovated lodge perched against the mountains with only 30 rooms. The loan nearly broke me, but I poured everything I had into it, designing each suite with local art and warm wood finishes. On opening weekend, I stood in the lobby as the first guest checked in, tears pricking my eyes. I had gone from a peeling apartment ceiling to running a property that travel magazines were suddenly asking to photograph. It felt like proof that my grit was not wasted. By 2023, Aspen Lux Hotels had grown into 6 locations across Colorado and New Mexico. Each one carried a piece of me, from the mountain-inspired decor to the locally sourced menus. There were moments when I would walk into a lobby filled with guests chatting by the fire, glasses clinking, and I would have to stop to catch my breath. I had built something real. Something permanent. Rachel chose a different path. She stayed in Denver, teaching English at a public high school not far from where we grew up. She was good at it, patient with her students, passionate about literature. But teaching never made her stand out in the same way my ventures did. Family gatherings often highlighted that difference. Relatives would ask Rachel about her classroom, nod politely, then turn to me with questions about hotels, investors, and expansion plans. I could see the flicker in her eyes during those conversations, the way her smile tightened. I wanted to reassure her, to remind her that what she did mattered, but the words never seemed to land right. She would laugh it off, say she preferred stability over the chaos of business. Sometimes I believed her, sometimes I wondered if jealousy simmered underneath. There was one winter when the imbalance between us became impossible to ignore. Rachel had racked up nearly $10,000 in credit card debt after an ill-advised trip to Europe and months of impulsive spending. She called me in tears, her voice breaking as she said the collectors were starting to call. Without hesitation, I wired the money to clear her balance. I told her it was a one-time thing, that she needed to be more careful. She thanked me profusely, promised to do better, and for a while she did. What stayed with me was not the money but the reaction of our parents. When they heard about it, Mom simply said I was a generous sister, and Dad chuckled that at least Rachel had someone to bail her out. No one mentioned the years I had scraped together rent or eaten canned soup for dinner to keep my own credit clean. No one acknowledged the sacrifice I had made. It was as if my role as family safety net was already assumed, not worthy of praise. I was the bank, not the daughter who deserved recognition. I told myself it did not matter. I had built resilience on being overlooked. Yet late at night, sitting alone in my condo overlooking the city, lights, the sting of being treated like an endless wallet lingered. Rachel never brought up the debt again, never even hinted at paying me back. Life moved on, but a part of me kept that memory like a stone in my pocket, heavy and undeniable. Still, I did not let bitterness stop me from loving her. I attended her school plays, cheered when her students won awards, and brought trays of catered food to her fundraisers. I wanted her to feel supported the way I had always wanted to feel. We shared dinners where she vented about grading papers late into the night, and I listened, offering advice when she asked. She once told me I was the only one she could count on. I smiled, though inside I wondered how long that statement would remain true. Success had not hardened me, but it had taught me boundaries. I began to draw lines with family, politely refusing when they asked for free services or steep discounts. Some relatives grumbled, hinting that I had changed. Maybe I had. Maybe I had finally realized that if I did not protect what I built, no one else would. Through it all, Rachel remained at the center of my loyalty. She was my sister, the girl who once carved our initials into a snow fort wall and promised to stand by me. I clung to that memory whenever the weight of unspoken resentment threatened to drag me down. I told myself that the imbalance between us was manageable, that love could stretch far enough to cover the cracks. For a time, it felt true. I had my growing empire, she had her steady classroom, and together we could navigate family dinners without too many bruises. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. My role as the provider, the rescuer, was becoming less a choice and more an expectation. And expectations, once cemented, have a way of turning into chains. I did not yet realize how heavy those chains would become or how close they would come to snapping when Rachel announced she was getting married. Rachel told me about Daniel one evening over dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant in Denver. The way her eyes lit up when she said his name made me realize she had already decided he was the one. He was older, successful in the tech world, and based in Austin. She said he was charming, generous, and ready to settle down. I listened, smiling where I was supposed to, but part of me felt a knot forming in my stomach. My sister had never been the type to talk about marriage, yet suddenly it was all she could think about. The first time I met Daniel, I understood why she was swept off her feet. He had that easy confidence of someone used to being listened to. He talked about his company, a software firm that had recently expanded into healthcare systems, with the smoothness of a man who knew how to sell both his ideas and himself. He was attentive to Rachel, pulling out her chair, holding her hand, whispering little asides that made her blush. I wanted to like him for her sake, but there was something about his polished charm that made me cautious. Meeting his family confirmed my unease. The Whitmores invited us to their home in Dallas for a weekend brunch. The house was sprawling, a red brick estate with white columns and perfectly manicured lawns. Inside, every surface gleamed as if it had been dusted that morning by invisible hands. Margaret, Daniel's mother, greeted us in a tailored cream suit that looked more suited for a boardroom than her living room. Her smile was polite but tight, and when Rachel introduced me, Margaret tilted her head slightly as if studying me under glass. "So you are Harper," she said, the businesswoman. "I hear you have built quite the little empire." Little. The word landed sharper than she probably intended. I forced a smile and replied that I had been fortunate and worked very hard. Margaret sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving mine. It is rare to see a woman stay single so long and put everything into her career. I suppose we all make choices. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, and I laughed lightly as if Margaret had meant it as a compliment. But my chest tightened. In that moment, I understood that to Margaret I was not Rachel's supportive sister. I was a curiosity, maybe even a warning of what happened when women did not follow the traditional script. Howard Daniel's father joined us a few minutes later, adjusting his cufflinks as he shook our hands. He was a tall man with a voice that carried the practiced authority of years in the courtroom. When Rachel proudly told him about my hotels, his response was a chuckle. "Aspen Lux Hotels," he said, raising his eyebrows. "Sounds quaint." I imagined him saying the same thing to a young lawyer fumbling through an argument, dismissing them with a single word. I bit down on my irritation, reminding myself that Rachel's happiness mattered more than my pride. But it was hard not to notice the subtle ways the Whitmores measured me and found me lacking. Every question they asked circled back to marriage, children, or Daniel's accomplishments. My businesses were reduced to anecdotes, my achievements treated like hobbies. Later that afternoon, Rachel pulled me aside in the garden. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Please don't take it personally. They just come from a different world." I nodded though. Inside, I felt the first real fracture between us. For years I had been her anchor, her safety net, her biggest supporter. Now, in front of her future in-laws, I was something else entirely. A reminder of choices Margaret disapproved of, a target for Howard's amused disdain. The rest of the weekend followed the same rhythm. Margaret asked Rachel about wedding colors and venues, barely glancing in my direction. Howard talked with Daniel about law firms and mutual acquaintances, occasionally throwing a question my way about whether hospitality was a stable industry. I answered with composure, but each time I felt smaller, as though my life's work was being whittled down by condescension. On the flight back to Denver, Rachel leaned against the window, humming softly as she scrolled through photos Daniel had taken of them together. I stared out at the clouds, my mind circling the moments that had left me unsettled. I wanted to protect her from what I sensed in the Whitmores, the quiet arrogance of people who believed money and pedigree mattered more than love or loyalty. I told myself I was overreacting, that I should focus on being happy for my sister. But I could not shake Margaret's words about my choices, or Howard's smirk when I mentioned my hotels. For the first time in years, I felt the old familiar burn of being underestimated, the same one I had carried through childhood when our parents overlooked me in favor of Rachel. Except now it was not just our family. It was her new family too. That night alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and stared at the skyline. The city lights blinked like stars against the dark. I whispered to myself that it did not matter what they thought. I had carved out a life that was mine, a life I was proud of. Still, their voices echoed in the back of my head, sharper than I wanted to admit. I reminded myself of Rachel's words in the garden, her plea for me not to take it personally. She was caught between two worlds now, and I was determined not to make her choose. But a small voice inside me asked how long I could hold back my own feelings before something snapped. It was only the beginning, though I did not know it then. Meeting the Whitmores had set a tone. I would not soon forget a tone that would follow us into every wedding plan, every family conversation, every quiet moment when I wondered if Rachel's promise to always stand by me could survive the weight of their disapproval. Rachel called me late one evening, her voice bubbling with excitement as she talked about venues. She had been touring ballrooms and ranches around Texas, but nothing felt right. Then she asked if she and Daniel could have the wedding at Collins Estate, the venue I had spent years restoring from an abandoned vineyard into a property that blended rustic charm with modern elegance. For a moment, I sat in silence, picturing my sister walking down the sweeping stone staircase in her wedding dress, surrounded by candlelight and flowers. It was the kind of place that had hosted senators, celebrities, and CEOs, but the thought of Rachel choosing it made me feel something warmer than pride. "Of course you can," I told her. "It would be my honor." She gasped, her gratitude pouring through the phone. I heard Daniel in the background saying it was perfect. When she asked about cost, I hesitated only briefly. The standard deposit was $125,000, but I knew what it would mean for Rachel to have her dream day without worrying about the expense. I told her I would only require $65,000, just enough to cover the initial expenses for staff and vendors. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Rachel burst into tears. "Harper, are you serious?" she whispered. "That is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me." The following weekend, she came to Denver with Daniel and the Whitmores to tour the estate. Watching Rachel step into the grand hall, her eyes widening as she took in the vaulted ceilings and cascading chandeliers, made the years of sacrifice worth it. She ran to me and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over again. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the old days, just the two of us against the world. But Margaret's reaction was different. She walked slowly through the hall with her arms crossed, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Finally, she glanced at Howard and said flatly, "At least it will save us a good amount." Her words stung. There was no acknowledgement of my generosity, no warmth. Just cold arithmetic. Howard nodded and gave a half smile as if the matter was already settled. Daniel, sensing the tension, quickly changed the subject and asked about menu options. I threw myself into planning meeting with my catering director to design a menu Rachel would love and working with my staff to block off the weekend. I kept telling myself this was bigger than me, that my job was to make my sister's day unforgettable. Yet Margaret's tone lingered in my ears like a thorn I could not shake. Later that evening, as guests were leaving after a small tasting, I stepped into the side hallway to take a call from one of my hotel managers. The conversation was brief, but as I rounded the corner back toward the dining room, I froze. Margaret's voice drifted through the cracked doorway of the library. She was speaking to Howard in a hushed but sharp tone. "That girl is too independent. If Rachel keeps leaning on her, she will never learn her place. We need to make sure this wedding reflects our family, not hers." Howard chuckled low. "Do not worry, Margaret. We will put her in her place." I pressed my back against the wall, the words slicing through me. My chest tightened and my hands trembled. Independent. Out of place. Was that all they saw when they looked at me? Not the years of work, not the sacrifices, not the fact that I had just cut the deposit nearly in half for their son's wedding. To them, I was an obstacle. Rachel came looking for me a few minutes later, her face still glowing with excitement. "Did you hear Daniel talking about the ceremony spot near the vineyard?" she asked. "He thinks it would be perfect at sunset." I forced a smile and nodded, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. For her sake, I pretended nothing was wrong. She had no idea what her future in-laws had just said, and I was not about to ruin her joy. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed their words again and again. I had always believed that family loyalty was unshakable, that Rachel's promise to stand by me meant something. But now I wondered how strong that bond would remain once the Whitmores tightened their grip. I told myself I could handle it, that I had weathered worse. Still, I could not escape the feeling that I was no longer simply providing a venue. I was stepping into a battle I had not agreed to fight, one where the lines between love, money, and power were already being drawn. Jessica arrived at the estate the following week, her notebook in hand and an energy that immediately put me at ease. She was only 31, but already had a reputation in Denver for pulling off flawless weddings, the kind where every detail sparkled yet looked effortless. I had worked with her before, and knew she had the rare mix of creativity and discipline it took to wrangle demanding clients. Rachel loved her instantly. Daniel shook her hand politely. Margaret, however, looked her up and down as though assessing whether she was worthy of breathing the same air. At our first planning meeting, Jessica spread out swatches of linens and floral samples across the long oak table. Rachel leaned forward with genuine interest, pointing at soft ivory roses and shades of blush that matched her vision board. Margaret reached across her and pushed the samples aside, pulling out her own folder. She wanted deep burgundy arrangements, towering centerpieces dripping with crystals, and an entirely different lighting setup than anything Rachel had mentioned. Rachel's smile faltered, but she said nothing. Daniel cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. Jessica glanced at me, eyebrows raised, but continued to take notes as Margaret rattled off demands. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's voice became louder than anyone else's. She questioned the menu that my catering team had designed with Rachel, insisting it was too pedestrian, and demanded French cuisine flown in from Dallas chefs she knew. She wanted the ballroom repainted a shade darker, even though it had just been refinished last year. She criticized the vineyard ceremony spot, claiming the light would be unflattering for photos, and suggested building a temporary pavilion instead. Every time she spoke, Rachel stayed silent. Sometimes she nodded faintly, other times she looked down at her lap. Daniel would mumble that it was up to Rachel, but he never pressed further. Watching it play out felt like watching my sister disappear into the background of her own wedding. I tried to step in delicately, reminding Margaret that Rachel had her own preferences, that the estate's ballroom had strict preservation rules, that vendors were already under contract. She would smile tightly and respond with phrases like, "I am only thinking of what is best for the family," or, "Surely Rachel wants her day to be truly unforgettable." One afternoon, I walked into my office to find Jessica on the phone with a tight expression. She ended the call quickly and looked at me with hesitation. "That was the florist," she said. "Margaret contacted them directly and told them to void the order we placed. She wants to renegotiate under her name." A chill ran through me. Vendors at Collins Estate had strict contracts, and all communication was supposed to go through me or Jessica. If Margaret was already bypassing us, it meant she was not just interfering, she was actively undermining me. I confronted Rachel gently that evening when she stopped by for a cake tasting. "Do you know your future mother-in-law is trying to change contracts behind my back?" I asked. Rachel's eyes widened. "No, I had no idea." She hesitated, her fork hovering over the slice of lemon chiffon. "I am sure she just wants to help. You know how she is." "Help does not usually involve breaking contracts," I said sharply before softening my tone. "Rachel, this is your wedding. Do you even want these changes?" She looked at me with eyes that reminded me of when we were kids, when she wanted to please everyone and never rock the boat. "I just want everyone to get along," she whispered. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, kissed Rachel on the cheek, and complimented the cake. When I brought up Margaret's interference, he chuckled awkwardly. "You know my mom," he said. "She likes to take charge. It is easier to let her feel involved." Easy for you maybe, I thought, but not for me, not when my business reputation was on the line. Later that night, Jessica emailed me copies of the florist's amended invoice sent directly from Margaret. I read it 3 times, my jaw tightening with each line. Margaret had added thousands in additional flowers, demanded imported orchids, and requested delivery terms that were impossible. The signature line was left blank, as if daring me to either sign or challenge her. I printed the invoice and placed it on my desk. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from clarity. This was not about flowers or lighting or menu changes. Margaret was testing the limits of how far she could push me, and if I let her, she would keep pushing until Rachel's wedding no longer belonged to Rachel at all. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my office. For the first time since Rachel's engagement, I felt the simmer of something I had not allowed myself to feel until then. It was not just frustration. It was the first spark of anger. The next Sunday, our parents invited us all to dinner at their house in Boulder. I arrived early carrying a bottle of wine I thought Dad might like, but as soon as I stepped inside, I sensed the tension. Rachel and Daniel were already seated at the table with Mom fussing over them while Dad was pouring drinks. The air was tight, like everyone was bracing for something unspoken. We barely got through the salad before Mom turned to me. "Harper, I think you're being too rigid about the wedding plans. Margaret only wants the best for Rachel. Maybe you could ease up a little just this once." I set my fork down, forcing myself to stay calm. "Too rigid, Mom, she's going behind my back, voiding contracts I signed. That isn't just a difference of taste, that's undermining me." Rachel let out a sigh, her eyes darting toward Daniel before she spoke. "You are turning this into your stage, Harper. Everything feels like it has to go through you. It is my wedding, not your business showcase." Her words landed like a slap. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Dad cleared his throat as if to cut off the rising heat. "Your sister has a point. You've always been independent, Harper, and that is admirable. But maybe this is a time to let family decisions take precedence. Family decisions. I wanted to laugh. When had they ever considered me part of those decisions? Growing up, it had always been Rachel. They leaned on Rachel. They praised Rachel. They reassured. I was the one expected to stand on my own 2 feet, and I did. I built a company from nothing, bought my own home, carried my own weight. But I also remembered a promise they once made years ago when money was tight. They had looked at Rachel, the golden child, and told her that when the time came, the family house in Boulder would be hers. To me, they had said nothing. The message had been clear: Rachel would inherit their history, their roots, while I was expected to carve out my own. That memory pressed against my ribs now as I sat across from them. Maybe Rachel was right in one sense. Maybe I had made my business my shield, my way of proving that I could not be dismissed. But I had never asked for my company to be part of her wedding. She had asked me. She had hugged me when I offered her a reduced deposit, told me she was grateful. And now I was the problem. The conversation drifted back to safer topics, but I barely tasted the rest of the meal. After dessert, while Mom and Rachel chatted about dresses, Dad pulled me aside. His voice was softer than before, but the words still stung. You have always done fine on your own, Harper. You bought your own house in Denver. You built something strong. Rachel has always been different. She needs more. Try not to hold that against her. I nodded because arguing would have been pointless. Inside, though, something settled heavy in me. It was not just about the wedding. It was the pattern. I had been on the outside for years, long before Margaret arrived with her opinions and contracts. Driving back to Denver that night, the lights of the highway blurred as my chest tightened. I thought about the childhood promise Rachel once made to me, the one where she swore she would always stand by my side. I thought about how quickly she now chose silence when her fiancé's parents belittled me. And I thought about my own parents who never saw the imbalance, never noticed how their favoritism had drawn lines between us long ago. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something painful but liberating. I had already been excluded. Not just from Rachel's wedding, but from the idea of family unity I had clung to for too long. The wedding was only shining a harsh spotlight on a truth I had ignored. I stepped inside my quiet house, poured myself a glass of water, and set it on the counter. My reflection in the darkened kitchen window looked steady, almost too steady. For the first time in years, I let myself admit it aloud, my voice low and flat in the empty room. I was never really part of them, was I? The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had at dinner. It was the silence of something breaking, something that had been cracked for decades finally giving way. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was in the middle of reviewing contracts at my office. I glanced at the screen and saw Jessica's name. I answered quickly, expecting another minor update about catering or flower arrangements, but her voice was unusually hesitant. Harper, I need to tell you something. It is not easy to say. I set my pen down, the unease already creeping into my chest. Go ahead. She drew in a breath. I got a call late last night from Margaret and Daniel. They told me your invitation to the wedding has been canceled. For a second, I thought I had misheard. Canceled. That does not make sense. I own the venue. I paid the deposit. Jessica's voice softened like she was speaking to someone who had just been hit. They said you have been causing tension, that it would be better if you stepped back, but the deposit stays in place. They want the contract honored. I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles whitened. $65,000. Money I had discounted for Rachel out of love, money that was now being used to lock me out of my own space. My throat felt dry. And Rachel agreed to this. There was a pause on the line, heavy with things Jessica did not want to say. She finally exhaled. They told me it came from the family. I think you should talk to her directly. I ended the call and sat in stunned silence, the hum of the air conditioning filling the room. My sister, the same girl who once swore she would always stand by me, had signed off on erasing me from her wedding. And not just me, but any trace of what I had done for her. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly through Denver, the streets blurring past as I tried to breathe through the betrayal pressing against my chest. Every stoplight felt like a test of willpower, not to cry, not to let the weight of it crush me. I thought of Rachel's hug the day I told her about the reduced deposit, how her voice had cracked with gratitude. Was that gratitude real or just another mask she wore when it suited her? By late afternoon, I pulled into a small coffee shop I used to frequent in my 20s. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window staring at people walking by, all of them moving through their lives unaware that mine had just tilted off its axis. I dialed Rachel's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful at first, then faltering when she realized it was me. "Harper, hey. Did you know Jessica called me, that she told me my invitation has been canceled?" There was a pause. I could picture her pressing a hand to her forehead, eyes darting toward Daniel or Margaret. "Harper, it is complicated. Things have been tense, and the Whitmores feel like it is for the best." I laughed bitterly into the phone. "For the best, you mean for them? For Margaret's comfort? For your in-laws' pride? What about me? I am your sister." Her voice dropped, almost pleading. "You are making this harder than it has to be. Please just let it go, let it go." 2 words that sliced deeper than any insult. I ended the call before I could say something I would regret, though in truth the regret had already settled in. I sat there long after my coffee had gone cold, staring at the swirl of cream in the cup, my reflection distorted on the surface. That night, I returned home, pulling off my shoes at the door with mechanical movements. I stood in the quiet of my living room looking at the framed photos on the shelf. Pictures of birthdays, family trips, graduations, and in nearly every one Rachel was there smiling beside me. We had once been inseparable, and now she had chosen silence compliance over me. The sting of betrayal was sharper than I could have prepared for, not just because they had canceled my invitation, but because they had done it while keeping my deposit, as if my worth to them had always been transactional. $65,000 to buy my silence, to erase me from the celebration of a sister I had once believed would never turn away. I sat on the couch, the city lights glowing faintly through the blinds, and whispered the question I could not stop asking myself. How could she do this to me? The next morning, I woke with the weight of a stone pressing against my chest. Sleep had been thin, fractured by flashes of Rachel's face, Jessica's trembling voice, and the word canceled echoing in my head. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. Sitting in Denver, nursing hurt feelings would not give me answers. I needed to look into my sister's eyes and hear her tell me if this betrayal truly belonged to her or if it was manufactured by the Whitmores. I booked the first flight I could find to Dallas. Packing was mechanical. I folded 2 outfits, slipped my laptop into its case, and grabbed the envelope that still held the deposit receipts. My hands shook as I zipped the bag. For years, my work had been my fortress. Now that fortress had been turned against me, reduced to a pawn in someone else's power play. The flight was only 2 hours, but felt like an eternity. I stared out the oval window as the Rockies gave way to the endless sprawl of Texas. I remembered all the times Rachel and I had whispered promises as kids that nothing would ever come between us. I wondered if she even remembered those words or if they had been swallowed whole by Margaret's polished smile and Daniel's quiet compliance. By the time I stepped out of the Uber in Highland Park, my pulse throbbed in my ears. Their townhouse gleamed with new brick and spotless windows, the kind of place that screamed curated perfection. Lawns cut with ruler-straight edges, driveways dotted with imported cars. I stood at the gate for a moment, steadying my breath before climbing the steps and knocking. Daniel answered. He wore a crisp shirt sleeves, rolled phone still in his hand. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me. "Harper, I didn't know you were coming." I brushed past him, my heels striking the hardwood floor like punctuation. "I need to speak to Rachel." Her voice floated from the kitchen, soft but already tinged with unease. "I'm here." She appeared, drying her hands on a towel, eyes wide. "Harper, what are you doing here?" I locked my gaze on hers. "You canceled my invitation through Jessica. And you kept my deposit. Tell me that isn't true." Rachel's lips parted, but no words came. She clutched the towel like a lifeline. Before she could speak, a familiar sharp voice cut through the room. Margaret descended the staircase, her pearls catching the morning light. "I see we have company. How unexpected." I folded my arms. "Not unexpected. Necessary." Margaret's smile was a razor's edge. Your presence only breeds discord. We've decided it is best for Rachel's wedding if you step aside. The deposit is business. You should understand that given your line of work." My voice cracked with restrained fury. "Without me there is no business. Without my venue, without my staff, there is no deposit to claim." She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with cold amusement. "Do not overestimate yourself, Harper. Success has made you arrogant. What you have is a stroke of luck, nothing more. Families like ours can purchase 10 venues like yours without a second thought." Daniel shifted uneasily, looking from his mother-in-law to me. "Maybe we should all calm down." But Margaret lifted her hand, silencing him without even glancing his way. "Rachel deserves a wedding free from your drama." Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I turned to Rachel, desperate for a flicker of loyalty. "Please, say something." Rachel's lips trembled. Her eyes darted between me and Margaret, then to Daniel. I could see the war inside her, but her voice never came. The silence wrapped around us, suffocating, louder than any accusation. Margaret pressed her hand lightly to Rachel's shoulder. "See, she knows what's best." Something inside me snapped at that. I stepped forward, my voice steady though my hands shook. "Rachel, do you remember who paid off your credit card debt when you couldn't breathe under the weight of it? Do you remember who lent you money when your car broke down, who stayed up all night editing your grad school essays because you were too tired to see straight? That was me. I was there when no one else was. And now you stand silent while they erase me from your life." Her eyes filled with tears, but she still said nothing. Daniel looked at the floor. Margaret smirked like she had won. The air in the room turned heavy, thick with betrayal. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame but from clarity. I had been begging for scraps of recognition from people who thrived on diminishing me. I picked up my bag from where I had dropped it by the door. My heels echoed again as I walked out, this time heavier, final. Rachel's voice trembled behind me, barely audible. "Harper, please." I stopped at the doorway, my hand resting on the polished wood. For a heartbeat I waited, hoping she would follow, that she would say the words that could still mend the fracture. But when I turned, she stood frozen, Margaret's hand still gripping her arm like a leash. I opened the door and the thick Dallas heat rushed over me. My chest felt tight but steady. I did not slam the door. I closed it gently because anger was no longer the loudest thing inside me. As I walked down the steps to the street, I realized silence had given me something Margaret's words never could. It had shown me exactly where I stood in their world, and it was no longer inside that house. I called another Uber and slid into the back seat, the driver asking politely where to. The words left my lips with more certainty than I felt. The airport. As the car pulled away, I leaned my head against the window. Dallas glittered under the harsh sun, but all I could see was the image of Rachel's eyes, full of fear but empty of courage. That silence would follow me back to Denver, heavier than luggage, heavier than loss. For the first time in years, I was no longer Rachel's shield, and maybe I thought it was time to stop being her victim too. The flight back to Denver felt strangely quiet, as if the cabin air itself carried the weight of everything left unsaid in Dallas. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, the land below rushing past in blurred lines, and let the silence settle into resolve. By the time we landed, the decision had formed clear as stone in my mind. If Margaret and her polished disdain wanted to treat me like a problem to erase, I would answer not with begging or tears, but with something they could not ignore. The next morning, I called Cassandra into my office. She arrived with her laptop, her hair pulled back, and a look on her face that told me she already suspected this wasn't about routine business. She sat down across from me, eyes sharp. "Harper, I've been going over the vendor files. Something isn't right." My stomach tightened. "What did you find?" She turned the screen toward me. "Margaret has been contacting our vendors directly. Caterers, florists, even the lighting company. She had contracts redrafted with Rachel's name at the top instead of yours. They cut you out completely." I leaned closer, reading the digital signatures, the subtle but unmistakable changes. My name erased, replaced like I had never existed. A chill ran through me. "How long has this been happening?" Cassandra shook her head. "Weeks, maybe longer. She's smart. She left just enough in place to make it look like routine updates. But the intent is obvious. They want you out of the picture entirely while still keeping what you gave them. I sat back, the leather of my chair creaking beneath me. It was worse than I imagined. They weren't just trying to silence me socially. They were dismantling me professionally, stripping away the years I had poured into building Summit venues and Aspen Lux. I didn't trust my voice, so I picked up my phone and dialed Patricia Lane, my attorney. Patricia was steady, sharp, and had guided me through contracts big and small. Within an hour, she was in my office, her briefcase snapping open with a familiar click. Patricia adjusted her glasses and spread out the vendor files Cassandra had uncovered. She read each one with practiced eyes, making neat notes on her legal pad. Finally, she set her pen down and looked directly at me. Harper, this is not just a family dispute. This is breach of contract. They took your money, they accepted your terms, and now they're cutting you out while holding on to $65,000. If you want to pursue this in court, I can promise you we win. Her words hit me like a gavel. Win. Such a simple word, but so heavy with meaning. For years, winning had meant Rachel smiling, our parents approving, my success overlooked but intact. This was different. This was not about keeping peace. This was about taking back my name, my work, my dignity. I rubbed my temples, trying to slow the rush of thoughts. If I sue, it becomes public. Rachel's wedding would be overshadowed by court hearings and legal filings. She would hate me. Patricia leaned forward, her tone even but firm. They are counting on you to hesitate because it's family. They know you care too much about appearances. That's why Margaret feels bold enough to do this. But Harper, this isn't about appearances anymore. It's about protecting what you built. Cassandra nodded in agreement. And it's not just the money, it's the precedent. If you let them get away with this, every partner and vendor who hears about it will wonder if you can be pushed around. I looked at the two women sitting across from me, their loyalty, steady and unwavering. My heart ached because I knew they were right. Yet, a part of me still clung to Rachel's tearful eyes, to the silence that had crushed me more than Margaret's cruelty ever could. I whispered the thought before I could stop myself. I don't want to destroy my sister. Patricia's voice softened. Then don't. We can build a strategy that holds Margaret accountable without turning it into a tabloid scandal. But you need to decide if you are willing to stand up. The room fell quiet. I thought about the deposit, the erased contracts, the mocking tone of Margaret saying my success was luck. I thought about Rachel's silence, the way she had let her future mother-in-law's hand anchor her in place. Finally, I straightened my decision, solidifying like steel. We'll fight. But not just with contracts and courts. I want this to be more than legal. This is personal. I want them to know I am not disposable. Patricia's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then we'll fight on both fronts. I'll prepare the filings. You prepare your own message. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders loosening just enough to let air in. For the first time since Jessica's call, I felt something other than helplessness. I felt the stir of control. Cassandra closed her laptop, her eyes burning with quiet pride. Whatever you decide to do, Harper, you won't be alone. After they left, I sat in my office, the Denver skyline stretching wide beyond the windows. The mountains in the distance looked unmovable, eternal. I envied their certainty. I pulled a blank sheet of paper from my drawer and wrote 2 words at the top: family and business. For years, I had let those words blur together, believing loyalty meant sacrifice. But as the ink dried, I knew they could no longer coexist the way they once had. This was not just about $65,000. It was about the years of being the shield, the rescuer, the afterthought. It was about the silence in Rachel's eyes and the smirk on Margaret's lips. The battle ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, I was ready to fight, not just for contracts, but for my own name. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into the drawer, and turned off the desk lamp. The city outside glowed with scattered lights, each one a reminder that even in darkness there was power waiting to be claimed. And I intended to claim mine. The drive back to Dallas felt like moving toward a storm I could no longer outrun. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I rehearsed the words I would say, words that had been burning inside me for weeks. This time I wasn't coming as the sister desperate to keep peace. I was coming as a woman demanding her place. The Whitmore's home in Highland Park was immaculate, a brick mansion lined with manicured hedges and iron gates that gleamed in the Texas sun. When I pulled into the driveway, I could already see Rachel's car parked to the side, her presence a reminder of what was at stake. Inside, the two families sat gathered in the Whitmore's expansive living room. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. Margaret sat upright in an armchair like a queen on her throne. Howard pacing with a scotch in his hand, his jaw tight. Daniel leaned against the mantel, silent, eyes lowered. My parents were perched together on the edge of a sofa, nervous but silent, as if waiting for instructions. Rachel rose when she saw me, her hands twisting together, her face pale. "Harper, I didn't know you were coming today." I steadied, my voice clear and unshaken. "I asked for this meeting. It's long overdue." Margaret's lips curved into a cold smile. "So this is the dramatic entrance. I suppose you're here to make more demands." I ignored her, turning to Rachel. "This is simple. Either I attend your wedding as a guest of honor recognized for the role I played in making it possible, or there will be no wedding at Collins Estate at all." The room fell into stunned silence. Howard slammed his glass onto the mantel, amber liquid sloshing. "You dare threaten us? After everything we've invested in this wedding, after the time, the contracts, the money?" I held his gaze unflinching. "I invested more than money. I gave you my venue at half its worth. I gave you my trust. And what I got back was betrayal." Margaret's voice cut through like ice. "You were paid. That deposit was a business transaction. Nothing more. And quite frankly, your presence would be disruptive. My son deserves a wedding without your theatrics." My chest tightened, but I forced the words out steady. "Without me, there is no venue. No caterer, no contracts that hold. You erased my name from papers you never had the right to touch. That is not business, that is theft." Howard stepped forward, his voice raised. "You think you can strong-arm us with your threats? We can buy 10 estates like yours." I turned toward Rachel again, ignoring the heat rising in my face. "Do you remember what you said to me the night after Dad's accident? You held my hand and said, no matter what happens, we'll always stand together. You promised me." Rachel's lips trembled, her eyes glistening. I saw her swallow hard, caught between the weight of memory and the pressure of the room. Margaret leaned forward, her tone sharp and commanding. "Rachel, if you side with her, you can forget the Whitmore name. You'll walk away from this family and everything that comes with it." Daniel finally shifted, his jaw tightening, but still he said nothing. His silence was a verdict of its own. Rachel's hands shook at her sides. I could see her body trembling, caught between the mother she had always obeyed and the sister who had always shielded her. My parents sat frozen, my mother wringing her hands, my father staring at the floor. They would not intervene. This choice was Rachel's alone. Margaret's voice grew harsher. "Choose Rachel, right now. Us or her." The room held its breath. I felt the weight of years pressing down every sacrifice, every silent wound. For a moment, I thought Rachel would fold the silence, stretching long enough to break me all over again. Then her voice cracked, trembling but clear. "My sister will be there. If she isn't welcome, then I won't marry at all." The air shifted like glass shattering. Margaret's face went pale, her mouth tightening into a furious line. Howard muttered a curse under his breath and turned away. Daniel closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as if relief and dread had collided all at once. I stood motionless, my heart pounding in my ears. The words had come from her, not me. Rachel had chosen. For the first time in years, she had chosen me. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stepped closer, her voice breaking. "I can't do this without you, Harper. I won't." Margaret rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake, Rachel. A mistake you will regret." Rachel shook her head, wiping her face with the back of her hand. The mistake would be letting you erase the one person who has always been there for me." The room buzzed with tension, but in that fragile silence, something inside me shifted. For so long, I had been fighting to be heard, to be seen. And now, for the first time, Rachel had raised her voice with mine. I did not smile, did not gloat. I only stood still, the moment pressing into me like the first breath after drowning. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. For the first time, Margaret's power cracked. And in that crack, I saw space for something I had nearly given up on. Hope. The morning after that meeting, Dallas, society pages lit up with whispers sharper than any blade Margaret had ever wielded. Headlines appeared across local outlets hinting at drama behind the Whitmore wedding, asking why the bride's younger sister had nearly been barred from attending. Some pieces were subtle, written with the careful touch of columnists who fed on scandal but avoided libel. Others were blunt, naming me as the sister Harper Collins of Denver, owner of Collins Estate, and asking why such a prominent venue owner had been treated as an outsider in her own family. At first, I thought it was gossip that would fade, but then it snowballed. A lifestyle magazine ran a feature titled "The Whitmore Wedding That Almost Wasn't," and by midweek reporters were digging into every crack they could find. What they uncovered was not just about me. The name Whitmore had weight in Dallas, tied to oil, real estate, and finance, but it also carried shadows. An old scandal from 2018 resurfaced in bold print, one that many had tried to bury. Howard Whitmore had been accused of questionable investments after a failed development left dozens of small business owners unpaid. The charges had disappeared in a haze of settlements and influence, but the bitterness had never fully died. This time, it wasn't the press alone fueling the fire. A florist from Austin, one of the vendors Margaret had berated over contracts, gave an interview, her words dripping with long-suppressed anger. She described Margaret as impossible, arrogant, and dismissive, painting her as the face of a family who thought money erased decency. Another vendor quietly leaked details of the way Margaret had tried to rewrite agreements without permission. Soon the picture that emerged was not of an elegant society matron, but of a woman drunk on power and entitlement. People connected the dots. My name came up not as the villain, but as the wronged party. Journalists noted that while Margaret was accused of intimidation, I was still standing, running a respected venue in Denver, my contracts clean, my vendors loyal. My silence in the press contrasted with Margaret's angry denials, and it only deepened the sympathy toward me. I hadn't orchestrated any of it, but it felt like karma had finally stopped passing me by. At a cafe in Uptown, I overheard two women at the next table whispering about the Whitmores. One leaned in, her voice carrying over the clink of cups. Can you believe she tried to cut her own sister out of the wedding? The other shook her head. Money doesn't buy class. Everyone in Dallas knows that now. Rachel called me that evening, her voice raw. I'm sorry you're being dragged into this, Harper. I never wanted the world to know our family like this. I told her the truth, steady but soft. I didn't leak anything, Rachel, but people remember. And they were waiting for the right story to push it all back into the light. There was silence on the other end before she whispered, maybe it's about time. Daniel stayed silent in public, never giving a statement, never defending or condemning. His absence from the conversation said more than any words. People noticed. They began to speculate that the groom himself was distancing from his future in-laws. Howard tried to stage control, releasing a statement about his devotion to his daughter's happiness, but the damage was done. Margaret's name became a punchline at Dallas cocktail parties, her reputation bruised in a way she could not hide with pearls and silk. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with quiet gratitude. Vendors who had once suffered her sharp tongue or high-handed demands reached out, some thanking me for standing up, others admitting they were the ones who had helped the press connect the dots. I realized then that my professional reputation, something I had built brick by brick, had become my shield. At dinner with Cassandra and Patricia back in Denver, I laid it out. Patricia smirked, sipping her wine. They're unraveling on their own. You hardly need a courtroom when the court of public opinion is doing the work for you. Cassandra leaned forward, eyes bright. People are finally seeing what we've always known. Margaret doesn't create beauty, she strangles it. You create space for it to thrive, Harper. That's why the vendors came to you. Her words landed deeper than I expected. For years, I had felt invisible in my own family. Now strangers were seeing me more clearly than my parents ever had. Rachel came to Denver the following weekend, slipping away from the chaos in Dallas. We sat together in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses between us. She looked tired, her face softer without makeup, her eyes rimmed red. "They're saying things about Mom I can't bear to read," she murmured. "But I can't defend her anymore. Not after what she did to you." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "You don't have to defend her. You just have to decide who you want standing next to you when you walk down that aisle." Her fingers tightened around mine. "I want it to be you. More than anyone." Hearing that, I felt a swell in my chest that words couldn't hold. After all the battles, all the silence, she was finally choosing. The Dallas society that once orbited around Margaret began to shift. Invitations stopped coming, her charity appearances drew fewer attendees, whispers followed her into every room. I heard from a cousin who lived nearby that people joked behind her back, mocking her downfall, saying the Whitmores had finally met their match. I didn't revel in her humiliation, but I didn't deny the satisfaction either. The cracks in her power had widened into fractures, and for once she was the one standing exposed. As Rachel prepared for the wedding in quiet defiance of her mother's control, I felt the bond between us knit back together, fragile but real. She called me daily, sometimes to talk about the color of flowers, sometimes just to sit in silence on the line. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. In Dallas, Margaret fought to maintain her mask. In Denver, I focused on holding my ground. Somewhere between the two cities, a balance was shifting, a truth long buried, finally clawing its way to daylight. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for my sister to rescue me. I wasn't waiting for my parents to acknowledge me. I was standing in my own power, watching as the woman who had tried to erase me faced the weight of her own choices. And the city that once adored her was laughing instead. The morning of Rachel's wedding arrived clear and bright, the kind of day that felt like it had been ordered straight from a bridal magazine. I stood at the back of the Collins Estate ballroom, the place I had built with my own hands and vision, watching the last of the flowers being placed and the candles lit. Out of the original 280 guests, only 180 remained. The missing 100 were not a coincidence. They were the very people who once orbited around Margaret, now suddenly busy or too hesitant to be associated with her tarnished name. When Rachel slipped into her gown upstairs, I was there beside her, holding the veil steady as she breathed deeply. The tension in her shoulders told me she was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. She looked at me through the mirror, her eyes shining. "Harper, thank you. If you hadn't fought for me, I would have let them control everything, even my marriage." I brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You fought too, Rachel. You chose me when it mattered. That choice was yours." Downstairs, the first notes of the string quartet began. Guests filed in, filling the space with hushed voices and the rustle of silk and linen. I caught sight of Howard standing stiffly by the front row, his jaw clenched as if the entire event were a hostile takeover he needed to endure. Margaret sat beside him, her posture perfect, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not look at me. Not once. As the ceremony began, Rachel walked down the aisle with a grace I had never seen in her before. Daniel's face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment all the chaos faded, leaving only two people promising their lives to each other. I stood close, the maid of honor, my bouquet trembling only slightly in my hands. When the vows ended and the applause rose, I looked out at the crowd. It was smaller than planned, but stronger, warmer. The people who had come were here for Rachel and Daniel, not for prestige or photographs. It felt real, not staged. At the reception, glasses clinked, laughter rippled, and for the first time in months, I felt a peace settle in my chest. Margaret remained quiet, her presence like a shadow in the corner of the room, while Howard made an effort to shake hands and keep appearances. Every time his smile wavered, I saw the truth. Their power in this city had cracked beyond repair. Later in the evening, Daniel found me near the bar. He placed a hand gently on my arm and spoke low so no one else would hear. "If it weren't for you, Rachel would never have stood against them. You gave her courage." The sincerity in his eyes startled me. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know." When it was time for speeches, I walked to the center of the room, my heart pounding as every eye turned toward me. I looked at Rachel, then at Daniel, and finally at the guests gathered. Family is not defined by blood alone. I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled slightly. It is not the people who take from you or silence you. It is the people who stand beside you, who lift you when you fall, and remind you who you are when you forget. Rachel has been my sister from the beginning, but tonight she reminded me that being family means choosing each other again and again. Applause filled the room, some polite, some fierce, but Rachel's tears were what mattered. She reached for my hand as I sat back down, squeezing it with a force that told me everything I needed to know. The night unfolded in warmth and light, with dancing laughter and moments that stitched new memories into old wounds. By the time Rachel and Daniel stepped out beneath a shower of sparklers, I no longer felt like an outsider. I felt like a part of something stronger, something that had survived fire and come through brighter. Margaret left without saying a word. Howard followed her, his face blank. Their silence was not victory. It was defeat. As I watched the newlyweds drive away, I knew the battle that had consumed us all was finally over. I had not only protected my sister, but reclaimed myself. I was no longer the girl fighting for scraps of love. I was a woman who had drawn her line and stood firm. And to those of you listening, maybe you know what it feels like to be used, overlooked, or told to shrink so someone else can shine. Maybe you have had to set boundaries with family or walk away from people who claim to love you while they hurt you. If you have ever faced that, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments, subscribe to stay with me, and if this touched you, like this video so more people who need to hear it can find it. Because family is not who breaks you. Family is who stands beside you when the world tries to.